Hello everyone, my name's Iman. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we're going to cover Chapter 6 for our MCAT Biology playlist, and this chapter is titled The Respiratory System. In this chapter, we're going to cover the following objectives. First, we're going to go over the anatomy and mechanics of breathing. We're going to walk through the structures of the respiratory tract, how breathing works, the different lung volumes, and how breathing is regulated by the brain. Then we're going to explore other functions of the respiratory system, things like gas exchange, thermoregulation, immune defense, and how the lungs help maintain blood pH. With this introduction in place, let's begin with Objective 1 and discuss the anatomy of the respiratory system. The lungs, they're located in the thoracic cavity. That's the part of the body that's surrounded by the rib cage. This cavity is specially structured to allow for breathing, meaning it's going to provide space for the lungs to expand and contract as we inhale and exhale. Now let's follow the path of air as it enters the body. Air enters through the external nares, also known as the nostrils, and they move into the nasal cavity. Inside the nasal cavity, the air is filtered by two important defenses: mucous membranes and small hairs called vibrissae. These help trap dust, pathogens, and other particles before the air travels any deeper into the body. Next, the air passes through the pharynx. This is a shared pathway for both food and air. This is why you can breathe and swallow through your mouth or nose. Just below the pharynx is the larynx. The larynx is strictly for air. It will not allow food to pass through. At the top of the larynx is an opening called the glottis, and it's protected by a flap called the epiglottis. When we swallow, the epiglottis is going to fold down to cover the glottis, and that will prevent food or liquid from entering your respiratory tract. Now, the larynx also contains the vocal cords. The vocal cords are structures that are made of skeletal muscle and cartilage that allows us to produce sound when air passes through them. From the larynx, air continues downward through the trachea, which is a tube that conducts air to the lungs. The trachea then splits into two main bronchi, one for each lung. The bronchi and larger airways, they're going to be lined with cilia. These are tiny hair-like structures that move rhythmically, and they help trap dust and debris and even push mucus back up towards the throat where it can be coughed up or swallowed. Each main bronchus enters the lung, and then it branches into smaller and smaller tubes. These smaller branches are called bronchioles. Eventually, the bronchioles lead to tiny air sacs called alveoli. The alveoli are small, balloon-like structures where gas exchange takes place, and they are surrounded by a dense network of capillaries that allow oxygen to move into the blood and carbon dioxide to be removed from it. The figure you see here helps us visualize everything we talked about. Here's the nasal cavity, the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, the two bronchi, and the right and left lung. Now, I also want to summarize the pathway we just described. Again, we start at the nostrils, also called the external nares. From there, air moves into the nasal cavity, then through the pharynx. That's the shared space for air and food. Next, air passes through the larynx, which directs it into the trachea. The trachea splits into two bronchi, which enter each lung and branch further into bronchioles. Finally, the air reaches the alveoli, the site of gas exchange. Now that we've mapped out the full path that air takes through the respiratory tract, let's zoom out and talk about the physical structures that support the lungs and make breathing possible. Each lung is surrounded by a set of membranes called the pleurae. These pleural membranes form a closed sac that the lung expands against during breathing. There are two layers here: the visceral pleurae, that's the inner layer that's directly attached to the surface of the lung, and the parietal pleurae, which is the outer layer that lines the inside of the chest wall. Between these two layers is a narrow space called the pleural cavity, and it contains a thin layer of fluid. This fluid, it acts as a lubricant and it allows the pleural layers to slide smoothly past each other as the lungs inflate and deflate. But this isn't just for physical support. This setup is also really important to how we generate the pressure differences that allows us to breathe. And to fully understand that, we have to look at the muscle that powers most of our breathing, the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a thin, dome-shaped sheet of muscle that separates the thoracic cavity, which is where the lungs and heart are, from the abdominal cavity. Now, when it contracts, the diaphragm flattens out and it moves downward. That's going to increase the volume of the chest cavity, and it will help to pull air into the lungs. So together, the diaphragm and the pleural membranes, those are central players in the mechanics of breathing. Now, let's break down how breathing actually works, starting with the pressures involved. Breathing relies on pressure differences between the lungs and the intrapleural space. That's the narrow fluid-filled space between the visceral and parietal pleurae. These pressure differences are what allow air to move in and out of the lungs. Let's begin with inhalation. During inhalation, the diaphragm contracts and flattens downward. At the same time, the external intercostal muscles, those are the muscles between your ribs, they will pull the rib cage upward and outward. And those actions together will increase the intrathoracic volume, meaning the space inside the chest cavity are going to expand. Now, as the volume increases, the intrapleural pressure decreases. Now, because the pressure inside the lungs is higher than the pressure in the intrapleural space, the lungs will begin to fill that space. And air flows in to equalize the pressure. This is called negative pressure breathing because it's the drop in pressure that pulls air into the lungs. Now let's look at exhalation. In passive exhalation, like when you're at rest, the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles, they're going to relax. And that causes the chest cavity to shrink. As the volume of the thoracic cavity decreases, the intrapleural pressure is going to rise and the lungs are going to recoil. This recoil happens because of two things. One, the elastic nature of the lung tissue, and two, the surface tension inside the alveoli. Together, these forces push air out of the lungs. Now, during active exhalation, like when you're speaking, singing, or exercising, now additional muscles are going to get involved. The internal intercostal muscles and the abdominal muscles, they're going to contract, and that's going to help to further compress the chest cavity, and it will force air out more quickly. Finally, to keep the alveoli from collapsing completely as the lungs deflate, the body produces a surfactant. Surfactant reduces surface tension in the alveoli, and that stabilizes them during recoil, and it makes sure they remain open for the next breath. Now that we've seen how air moves in and out of the lungs, let's talk about how we actually measure those movements. To assess how well the lungs are functioning, we use a device called a spirometer. A spirometer tracks how much air is inhaled and exhaled and how quickly. And it's commonly used in clinical settings to evaluate lung health and diagnose respiratory conditions. With that being said, let's walk through the key lung volumes that you're going to need to know for the MCAT. We're going to start with the total lung capacity, or TLC. This is the maximum amount of air that your lungs can hold after a full deep inhalation. For most adults, this is about 6 to 7 liters. Next, we have residual volume. This is the amount of air left in the lungs after you exhale. Now, even when you breathe out as much as you can, there's still a small volume of air that stays behind to keep the alveoli from collapsing. Now, here's an important point. Residual volume, it cannot be measured directly with a spirometer. Then we have vital capacity, or VC. This is the difference between the maximum and minimum lung volumes. In other words, it's the total amount of air that you can move in and out of your lungs. Mathematically, vital capacity is equal to total lung capacity minus residual volume. Next is tidal volume, or TV. This is the amount of air you breathe in or out during a normal, relaxed breath. It's just your regular breathing at rest. Then we have expiratory reserve volume, or ERV. This is the extra amount of air you can forcibly exhale after a normal exhale. So after breathing out normally, ERV is the additional push of air that you can force out. Finally, we have inspiratory reserve volume, or IRV. This is the extra amount of air that you can forcibly inhale after taking a normal breath in. Now, if you look at the diagram here, you can see how all of these volumes fit together in a full respiratory cycle. Right in the middle, we have tidal volume, which reflects our regular everyday breathing. This is the amount of air you inhale and exhale at rest. But your lungs are capable of doing much more than that. So if you inhale beyond a normal breath, the extra volume you can bring in is your inspiratory reserve volume. On the other hand, if you exhale forcibly or forcefully beyond a normal breath out, then that is your expiratory reserve volume. Together, these three, tidal volume, IRV, and ERV, they make up your vital capacity, and that represents the full range of air that you can move in and out when you try your hardest. Now, below that, we see the residual volume, which is the air that always remains in the lungs, even after the strongest exhale. This is trapped air that keeps the alveoli from collapsing, and it allows for continuous gas exchange between breaths. And when you stack all of these volumes, tidal, reserves, and residual, you get the total lung capacity. That's the complete volume that your lungs can hold. And this leads us to an important question. How does your body know when to breathe? That's where the nervous system comes in, and that's the next thing we're going to discuss. Breathing is primarily regulated by a region of the brainstem called the ventilation center, and it's located in the medulla oblongata. This center automatically sends rhythmic signals to the diaphragm and other respiratory muscles, and it controls the pace of breathing, even when you're asleep, even when you're not consciously thinking about it. The medulla receives information from these special sensors called chemoreceptors that monitor the chemical composition of the blood, especially carbon dioxide levels. If carbon dioxide starts to accumulate, this is a condition known as hypercarbia or hypercapnia, the chemoreceptors are going to detect this change, and then they will send signals to the medulla to increase the respiratory rate. The goal is to get rid of excess carbon dioxide by breathing it out faster. Now, these chemoreceptors, they can also sense oxygen levels, but their response to low oxygen is usually weaker, and it only kicks in strongly when oxygen levels drop significantly. So while oxygen matters, carbon dioxide is the main driver of our day-to-day breathing rate. Now, you can override this automatic control temporarily. So for example, you can hold your breath on purpose, or you can breathe faster voluntarily. But again, that control is limited. If you hold your breath too long, carbon dioxide builds up in the body, and eventually the medulla is going to force you to breathe. It's going to override your conscious control. On the other hand, if you're hyperventilating or you're breathing too rapidly, you're going to remove too much carbon dioxide from your body. And this drop in carbon dioxide, it can lead to alkalosis. And if levels get too low, it can actually cause you to faint or stop breathing because the medulla doesn't sense strong enough carbon dioxide signal to continue ventilation. Now, the two figures at the bottom here show this contrast. So in image A, we see carbon dioxide accumulating due to hypoventilation, meaning not breathing enough. And in image B, carbon dioxide is removed faster than the body produces it, which happens during hyperventilation. We have now completed objective 1, and we can move into objective 2, which is about functions of the respiratory system. The respiratory system doesn't just move air in and out. It performs several other essential functions that help maintain homeostasis. These include gas exchange, thermal regulation, immune defense, and pH control. We're going to start with discussing gas exchange first. Gas exchange takes place in the alveoli, which are the small balloon-like sacs at the very end of the respiratory tree. These structures are surrounded by tiny capillaries, and they provide a massive surface area for gas movement. Here's how it works. Deoxygenated blood that is low in oxygen and high in carbon dioxide, it's going to arrive at the lungs via the pulmonary arteries. These arteries, they carry blood from the right side of the heart directly to the capillaries that surround the alveoli. The alveoli themselves are air-filled and they're lined by a single layer of thin epithelial cells. Right next to them, the capillaries are also lined by a single layer of endothelial cells. Together, the alveolar wall and the capillary wall are just one cell thick, and that's going to minimize the diffusion distance. This setup is going to allow for efficient gas exchange by diffusion. This is a process that does not require any energy. Because gases move from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration, oxygen flows into the blood and carbon dioxide flows out into the alveolus to be exhaled. This movement is driven by steep concentration gradients, which are maintained by both ventilation, bringing fresh air into the alveoli, and good blood flow, which constantly delivers carbon dioxide-rich blood and carries away oxygenated blood. Once oxygen has diffused into the bloodstream, the newly oxygenated blood returns to the heart through the pulmonary veins, which delivers it to the left atrium. From there, it gets pumped out to the rest of the body. So in short, pulmonary arteries bring in carbon dioxide-rich, oxygen-poor blood. Gas exchange happens across one thin cell layer. Pulmonary veins carry the oxygenated blood back to the heart, and all of this happens passively. It's powered by diffusion and pressure gradients. Now we can discuss thermoregulation, which refers to how the body maintains a stable internal temperature. Your body can release or conserve heat by adjusting blood flow to the skin and respiratory surfaces, especially in the lungs. And this happens through two processes, vasodilation and vasoconstriction. When the body is trying to cool down, it triggers vasodilation. This means that the capillaries near the body's surface expand, and that allows more blood to flow through them. With more blood circulating near the surface, more thermal energy is lost to the environment. Now, when the body needs to conserve heat, like in cold conditions, it triggers vasoconstriction. In this case, the capillaries narrow so that less blood flows near the surface, and that really helps the body retain its thermal energy. So even though we often think of the lungs only for breathing, they can really help regulate body temperature too. Now let's move into the immune function of the respiratory system. Every time we inhale, we bring in not just air, but also dust, pollen, bacteria, and other potential pathogens. So the respiratory tract is equipped with several defense mechanisms to protect us. First, the nasal cavity is lined with vibrissae. These are tiny hairs and mucous membranes that together help trap larger particles. Next, we have the mucociliary escalator. This is a coordinated system of mucus and cilia. The mucus traps pathogens and debris, and the cilia beat upwards to move that material towards the throat, where it can be coughed up or swallowed or expelled in some way. The nasal cavity and saliva also contain lysozyme. This is an enzyme that targets the peptidoglycan layer of gram-positive bacteria, breaks down their cell walls, and kills them. Deeper in the respiratory tract, we have macrophages. These are immune cells that control the alveoli. They can engulf and digest pathogens, and importantly, they can also signal to the rest of the immune system when an invader has been detected. The mucosal surfaces of the respiratory tract are also covered in IgA antibodies. This is going to help neutralize pathogens before they can even enter deeper tissues. Finally, The respiratory system contains mast cells, which are part of the immune response. Mast cells have antibodies on their surface, and when they encounter a triggering substance, they're going to release inflammatory chemicals. And these responses can really help fight infection. But also, mast cells are involved in allergic reactions where the immune system overreacts to harmless substances like pollen. The last function of the respiratory system we want to talk about is pH control. Your body maintains a very narrow range of blood pH, around 7.35 to 7.45. And one of the ways it does this is by using the respiratory system to regulate carbon dioxide levels, which are directly tied to how acidic or basic the blood becomes. Now, this happens through a chemical equilibrium known as the bicarbonate buffer system, which you definitely need to know for the MCAT. We cover it in the MCAT general chemistry playlist, but we want to reiterate some of the parts of this here. Now, here's the reaction. Carbon dioxide plus water forms carbonic acid, which then dissociates into bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion. This reaction is reversible. And because it produces hydrogen ions, an increase in carbon dioxide results in a lower pH. So carbon dioxide functions like an acid in the body. So now with that in mind, let's look at what happens when blood pH drops. This is a condition called acidemia. In acidemia, the hydrogen ion concentration increases. And chemoreceptors are going to detect this rise in hydrogen ions, and they're going to signal the medulla oblongata to increase the respiratory rate. So what happens then? Well, breathing faster is going to help remove carbon dioxide from the blood. And as carbon dioxide levels fall, the equilibrium is going to shift left, which will reduce the amount of hydrogen ions in the blood, and that's going to raise the pH back towards normal. On the other hand, when the blood becomes too basic, this is a state known as alkalemia, the respiratory system is going to respond in the opposite way. In this condition, there are too few hydrogen ions. So to compensate, the body's going to slow down breathing, and it's going to allow carbon dioxide to accumulate. This shifts the buffer system equilibrium to the right, which will generate more hydrogen ions and bring the pH back down towards normal. So overall, the lungs play a very powerful role in acid-base balance, and they do that by adjusting carbon dioxide levels. With that, we've completed this chapter. I hope it helps. Please let me know if you have any questions, comments, concerns down below. Other than that, good luck, happy studying, and have a beautiful, beautiful day, future doctors.